Okay, so we're trying something new, and it's on account of some bad news that I got on Friday. I turned 30 on Friday. Friday was my birthday, but out of that, my wife got me this little camera, this digital camera, so I'm going to give that a try, get away from my puny little webcam that has to sit on top of my computer in my office at home. So now I've got a tripod, I've got the camera set up, I'm on campus right now, so we'll give this a shot. So I've got the projector going, hopefully you'll be able to read this. Maybe I can tweak this when I get home and get it on the computer. But this way I can sort of talk about the text, point out some things as I'm going. So we'll give that a try. So we're starting with Walt Whitman this week. And you've probably noticed, if you've started reading it already, or maybe you've read him in the past, that he's much different than the old school poems that we read last week, right? Last week's poems are much more formal and they're much more regular, right? A lot of times they'll have a very rigid rhyme scheme. They might have the same number of syllables in each line and those sorts of things. Does Whitman fall into that same kind of scheme? No, he does not. If I zoom out a little bit, we can look at the form of the poem, and again, I'm hitting on that idea of form. The form is very irregular, right? So if you can still hear me, we'll zoom out, scroll through a few pages, and you can see that we have some jagged lines, right? We have some short lines, we have long lines. Here's a short line: trippers and askers surround me, followed by a long line: people I meet, the effect upon me of my early life, or the ward and city I live in, or the nation. And just a little logistical thing. Here, this is the beginning of section 4. This line that begins with people, this is not 2 lines, it's actually 1 line. So Whitman writes really long lines, so this single line extends all the way across the page. You get to the margin, and it continues here. This is not the beginning of a new line. Whenever you have a line that overruns, you go ahead and indent it, kind of like you would indent a new paragraph. So when you see that happening, these aren't brand new lines, they're just overflows. So if you look at this one, this continues from margin to margin and then almost to the other margin again. So Whitman's form is a little bit different, right? Because most of the other poems that we saw have a tidy little shape, right? They almost look like a box on the page. Can you see that? I think you can see that. If I can find an eraser. Here we go. So formally, Whitman's a little bit different. And now the question we're going to ask, of course, is how does the formal difference account for the difference in content? Are Whitman's poems saying, is the content different than some of the other poems we've seen so far in this semester? And I think that they are different. If we take a look, well, we'll get to how they're different and what the content exactly is. I want to stick with the form first. Let's start at the very beginning of the poem. So we'll scroll up, beginning the first stanza. If we look on the second page in section 2, we have these really long lines again, right? We have lists, single sentences that extend for an entire stanza. But the first section is a little bit different. So let's just look at this first section. Because up until this point, especially in American poetry and probably around the world, you have that box type shape for the poem. You have regular meter, a certain number of syllables in each line, you have rhyme schemes and those sorts of things. So what Whitman does here is a big departure, not just in American poetry, but for poetry across the spectrum. We can zoom in. So let's look at this first stanza, because I've always found this first stanza of the poem very interesting. It's a long poem, right? It does a lot of different things, new, innovative things in content and in form. But let's read the first stanza out loud. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Now if you read that out loud, and I love reading Whitman out loud, he's a very audible poet, I think. It's a shame that he wasn't around when we had recording devices. But if you read this, I'll read the last 2 lines again. And what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. And in a way I feel like we've got that same sort of sing-songy structure, that sort of sound, that emphasis on sound that we got in some of the old school poems, right? So I feel like before we get into the second section with all of the long lines, he's almost using the first stanza as a transition from the old way of viewing poetry, with the emphasis on sound. We have assume and you, right? It's not a full rhyme. A full rhyme would be like assume and legume, or you and brew. So it's not a full rhyme, but it's a half rhyme. Assume and you. So he doesn't do this anywhere else in the poem, right? It's a long poem. It's 52 sections. So in the first stanza, he's playing with sound and this rhyme at the end of the line. He's also got repetition. Assume, assume, belonging, belong. Okay? Assume and you. So he's playing with sound, and he does this in the first stanza, and then he begins to depart, right? And so as we move down further in this first section, and then we get into the second section, that's when we've got really long lines, and the poem begins to look different, it begins to feel different. We don't have any sorts of rhyme, full, half, I, whatever, at the ends of lines anymore, right? So I almost wonder if this was an intentional choice by Whitman in almost easing the reader out of the old way of poetry and into this new way of poetry that Whitman is devising.